heroically? That's what we're going to talk about. So let's turn in our Bibles to Joshua chapter 2. The title of my message is Living Heroically. Tonight we're going to meet a woman who totally did that. A woman who learned to be a hero, who did something heroic, who chose to live heroically. And we're going to learn some lessons from her life that we can take and transfer to our lives. Well, if we're going to live heroically, the first thing we've got to do is we've got to let go of the past. So look with me, Joshua 2, verse 1. It says, "Now Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, 'Go, view the land, especially Jericho.' So they went, and they came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there." Now this is a generation after the Exodus. If you haven't read the book, you've seen the movie, right? The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. Maybe you went the animated route and you saw the Prince of Egypt. The point would be that this story takes place right after that story. So Joshua has succeeded Moses. The people, they've crossed the river and they're ready now to conquer the land that God has promised to them when they come to this place called Acacia Grove. Now, if that place name sounds familiar, it totally should. It was there in Acacia Grove, a generation before, that the men of Israel were seduced by the women of Moab. And so, long story short, as a result of their unfaithfulness to God and their unfaithfulness to their families, 24,000 people died. Crazy, right? That meant that many people went forward without a husband, or many went forward without a father or a son. Some went forward without a brother or a cousin, maybe without an uncle or a nephew. And you know that every year on an anniversary they would be reminded. You know that every year on a birthday they would be reminded. And you know for sure as they gathered in this place where all of that stuff went down not so long before, they would be reminded about how the choices of one generation affect the next. It makes me think about how I've been affected by the choices that my parents made. And it challenges me to think about how the choices that I'm making are affecting, my daughters and now granddaughter. That's right, you're looking at a relatively newly minted Grandpa and Mimi. We've got a 1-year-old granddaughter in Oklahoma City. And we just love her to pieces, as you can imagine. But this challenges me to think about how the choices that I'm making affect even her. Maybe your family history isn't entirely different from mine. Has there been something in your family, something that has gone on for generations, something that has happened over and over again? I'm talking about something destructive. I'm talking about something harmful and something hurtful. In my family, that thing has been alcoholism. My dad was an alcoholic. If he were here tonight, he would probably describe himself as a recovering alcoholic just because, that's the language that lots of people use today. But I'm really happy to say that my dad's been sober for years. Not before it cost him his marriage to my mother. And not before it very nearly cost him his second marriage and his job. But to see the way that my dad has put his life back together is an amazing thing. I'm really proud of him. Like, his life is so much better now that he's sober than it was before. But it wasn't just my dad, it was his dad. My grandfather was an alcoholic. It's funny because normally when you talk about a family member, even one that's passed, don't you try to picture them? As you talk about them, don't you try to see them as you remember them? And I have to be honest, like I'm struggling right in this moment to do that. Reason being that I could probably count on one hand the number of times that I saw my grandfather in my whole entire life. And it's not because there wasn't plenty of opportunity. He lived well into my adulthood. I should have lots and lots of happy memories of time spent with my grandfather, but I don't. He was sort of estranged from the rest of the family. You see, he and my grandmother were married and divorced twice to each other. They were married, they got divorced, they tried it again, it failed again, married and divorced twice. And it's not hard, is it, to think about what that was like for my dad. I mean, for my dad, that meant growing up largely without a father figure in the home. And for my dad, that meant growing up largely in poverty. My dad and his brothers, my uncles, lived with their mother, my grandmother, who lived with her mother, my great-grandmother, in public housing in San Bernardino, the projects known as Waterman Gardens. And you know that had to affect the way that my dad raised me and my sister Cheryl. You know, it's been some years now since my grandpa passed away. And soon afterward, I was in California. This is before I'd moved back. This is when I was still living in Austin, Texas, and pastoring the Calvary Chapel that I planted there in 1991. So I was out here for one of our annual pastors' conferences, and I stuck around an extra day so I could see my dad in Orange County. And so I'm in my dad's house just months after he's buried my grandfather. And my dad is telling me what it was like to lose his own dad, what it was like to travel to Stockton, where my grandfather spent his final years, what it was like to enter his home and to go through his personal belongings. And just then, my dad asked me if I would wait right there. He got up and went in the other room, and when he came back, he was carrying a box. I want to talk for a moment about this box because I've got one just like it, and I'm guessing some of you do as well. Do you have a box or a special place where you put like keepsakes, mementos, things that you don't want to lose track of, that you want to carry with you on this journey we call life, right? So I have one of those. It's a small wooden box that says San Diego on the front. I got it as a kid on a field trip to San Diego, and in that box is my high school class ring, some coins I've picked up in travels to other countries, some things like that. Now I have to admit, I haven't seen this box in a few years. It's in a storage unit in Austin, Texas. I know it's there, but I haven't seen it lately. Do you have a box like that? So Grandpa had a box like that. My dad brought it in, and he took the lid off and started moving things around inside the box, and then he started taking things out one at a time. He took out a document that was related to one of my grandparents' divorces. And then he reached back inside and he took out a picture of my grandfather holding my Uncle Bill when Bill was a baby. He's got Bill on his knee. Bill was later killed in action in Vietnam. And then my dad reached in the box and took out my kindergarten picture and my first grade picture and my second grade picture. Guys, I was blown away. Never in a million years would I have thought that my grandfather had pictures of me in a box. My mom had cut out school pictures like moms have done forever. You know, you get your school pictures, and moms cut out the little wallet-sized ones and mail them off to loved ones wherever they might be, and mine were in Grandpa's box. I have to admit, I felt conflicted about it, and I feel conflicted about it now. There was a part of me that felt really, really good that I made Grandpa's box. And there's another part of me that felt really, really bad. And that's the part of me that realized that whereas my box and your box is a box filled with memories, his was a box filled with regrets. Every single thing that came out of that box was a reminder of something that he'd had but lost, of something that he might have enjoyed right up until the end of his life, but instead didn't get to enjoy at all. And so whether we're talking about my grandfather's story, my family's history, or whether we're talking about the backstory to Joshua chapter 2, it's a reminder that there has to come a time when we say enough is enough. That it doesn't matter what has happened in your family. It doesn't matter how many times it's happened. It doesn't matter how long it's gone on. It doesn't matter if you have struggled with it yourself, as I have. We get to say that it stops here, it stops now, it stops with this generation, it stops with me. Can you feel the mood in Acacia Grove? Well, another similar insight has to do with the two spies. You notice that Joshua sent 2 spies into the land. Moses did the same thing a generation before, only he sent 12 spies. You remember that? So if you know the story, you know that 10 of those spies, they came back with a negative report. 10 of the spies are like, there is no way we can take the land. I don't care who God says we are. I don't care what God says we can do. We shouldn't even try it. And then 2 guys came back with a positive report. One of those was Joshua, by the way. And those 2 were like, oh, we so got this. Like, we're exactly who God says we are. We can do exactly what God says we can do. Why are we having this conversation? Like, why are we not taking the land right now? And sadly, as is often the case, even in a community of faith like a local church, the negative voices carried the day. And as a result, an entire generation was doomed to die in the wilderness. Their sentence, 40 years with time served. I mean, I want you to think about this. For 40 years, the best part of 40 years, they would wander in the desert waiting for everyone of a certain age to die. That's a lot of dying. That's a lot of burying. I mean, we can do the math. If there were 1.2 million adults, and that's considered a conservative estimate, and if they used every hour of daylight to bury people, then we're talking about funerals year after year, month after month, week after week, day after day, about 7 or 8 times per hour. They were burying someone. And you know that every single time another body slid beneath the sand, they would be reminded. They'd be reminded about what happens when we listen to the wrong voices. What happens when we listen to anyone who says anything other than what God says about who we are or about what we can do. Has that been your experience? You know, as we travel the country, we meet people all over who tell us that this has been their experience. Some people tell us that like for as long as they can remember, it's been their experience. Maybe that's you. You know, maybe for you it was a parent or a sibling. It could have been like a teacher or a coach. It could have been a pastor, like a youth pastor or a Sunday school teacher. In your adult life, maybe it's, you know, the person that you work for or a person that you work with. It could even be your spouse. But for as long as you can remember, you've been beat down by this negative story about you. Something other than what God says about who you are and about what you can do. And if that's been your experience, I am so sorry. I mean, the truth is, that can be really, really hard to overcome. It can be super hard to overcome. But you know, as we think about that, well, this has to be one more of those things where there comes a point in time where we say that, you know, going forward, it doesn't matter what anybody says. Anybody who says anything other than what God does about who I am or about what I can do, even if it's me, even if it's the voice in my own head telling me that I'm not enough, that I'm not fast enough, I'm not, you know, athletic enough, I'm not smart enough, intelligent enough, educated enough, spiritual enough, cool enough. I'm not going to listen to anybody who says anything other than what God says about who I am or about what I can do. Can you feel the mood in Acacia Grove? And so this gives us an idea of what it was like to be there then with them about to take these next steps. Now, as we rejoin the narrative, we have these spies, right? And they were sent to gather intelligence. It says especially of a place called Jericho. Now, if you Google Jericho, you'll find that they claim today that Jericho is one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Now, I don't know for sure about that, but I do know this. I mean, what we're most interested in is what was Jericho like in ancient times, right? What was Jericho like in Bible times? And we know that Jericho was heavily fortified with not just one, but 2 walls. So apparently the king of Jericho had promised voters that if elected, he would build not just 1 wall, but 2. And Moab would pay for it. I'm not sure what was happening there, but whatever you think about walls today, I'm talking about ancient times. And in the ancient world, it really was a matter of national security. I mean, if you lived in Jericho in Bible times, that wall was the difference between a good night's sleep and getting killed in your sleep. Your wife raped, your kids taken as slaves. That's the world they lived in. So this city, again, was heavily fortified, and it's helpful for us to know that. But it's insane because these spies, no sooner did their feet hit the ground in Jericho than they're found in the red light district. What? Like you would never see that coming. If you were reading the Bible for the first time, you'd never be like, I know where they're going to be when I turn the page. I mean, there's no way you would call that, right? Now, before you get the wrong idea, I don't believe that they were at Rahab's place to get under the covers. I believe they were there undercover. The success of their mission depended upon not drawing attention to themselves. It's likely that as they traveled to Jericho, they joined or were joined by other people traveling to Jericho. They walked through open city gates as part of a much larger group, and they followed the tourists to those parts of the city that tourists would go to. They found themselves where they found themselves. But we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the value that they might have placed in Rahab as an intelligence asset. I mean, think of it. For real. There's no telling who Rahab might have known or what she might have known. It was reasonable for them to think that somebody in Rahab's line of work might actually have access to information that no one else they were going to get close to would have. It makes perfect sense if you were on a mission like that of the spies that you want to talk to someone like Rahab. But don't you love that the Bible tells us the truth about her? There are so many reasons that's cool. Like, I'd like to do a whole sermon on all the reasons why that's cool. I've got to just pick one and then keep moving. So humor me for just a moment. I'll tell you one reason I think it's cool. I think it's cool because today we're hearing a lot of buzzwords. Everybody wants to talk about authenticity, transparency, vulnerability. Like so many other things we talk about at church, we're way better at talking about it than we are at practicing it. If you've been doing church for long, like I have, and by which I mean that this is not even your first church home, like over a lifetime, you've maybe had a number of church homes. And so you're going to know what I'm saying, even as I'm saying it, like you were somewhere at some point when someone got brave. They found their voice and they told their story like Miranda did tonight. Or maybe they just opened up and talked about their doubts, or they opened up and shared some of their struggles. And then you watched in horror as the people around them shamed them, shushed them, and ultimately shunned them. And you learn very quickly that church is not a safe place to keep it real, no matter what they say. But shouldn't it be? And again, if you were new to all of this and you stumbled on a story like this one where the hero is a prostitute, wouldn't you think, thank goodness, I have finally found a place where I can keep it real. I have finally found a place where I can tell my story and be open and honest about my doubts or my questions or my struggles. You would think that, right? Now, I'm so glad that you're in a church that values as one distinctive part of its culture grace. But what about people who aren't in a church that values grace? Or what if we all found ourselves at some future time in a church that wasn't a grace-giving culture? I think we could change the culture. I think we're way past the time where people in churches like that need to wait around for their leaders to figure something out and fix something. I think we fix it. We fix it by all agreeing that we're going to start telling our stories. Not only are we going to be brave and tell our stories, but when it's the other person's turn to be brave and tell their story, we absolutely refuse to be a part of that group that would otherwise shame, shush, or shun them. And boom, we change things really, really quick. We do at a grassroots level. That would be cool, right? Now, in fairness to Rahab, she may have done what she did as a matter of survival. Am I saying that what she did was okay? Of course not. Of course it's not okay. Of course it's not ethical or moral. Of course not. But I'm just saying, think about it. Aren't we learning in life that life is so much better if we take even 5 minutes to put ourselves in someone else's shoes before we decide that they don't matter, that they don't count, that they don't have any value, that they don't matter to God, that God doesn't have a plan for them or for their lives. You know, in Rahab's particular case, for a woman in the ancient world, it was rough. If you were a single woman and you didn't have family members taking care of you, it was really hard to survive. Like, Rahab couldn't just put her career hat on and reinvent herself. She couldn't just log into LinkedIn and start networking. The ancient world didn't work like that. And so, many times in the ancient world, and maybe more often than we suppose in the modern world, there have been women so desperate to find a way to survive that, they've done things they never would have dreamed of doing. Again, what if we just take a minute to put ourselves in someone else's shoes before we pass judgment? Could Rahab live heroically? Well, not unless she let go of the past. Think of all the guilt from her past. Think of all the guys. Think of all the hookups. Do you have a past? Are there skeletons in your closet? The truth is we've all done things that we're ashamed of. We've all done things that we're embarrassed by. We've all done things that we feel guilty about. But one of the biggest mistakes that we can make in this life is to allow guilt about our past to rob us of our future. And you know why we do that? We do that because we don't get forgiveness. I don't mean that you haven't received it. If you're a follower of Christ, you've received forgiveness. What I mean is we don't get it up here. What I mean is that we struggle to wrap our minds around the idea that God has forgiven us, or as we sometimes say, that God forgives and forgets. If the scriptures don't say that explicitly, they certainly teach it implicitly. Think of that Bible verse that talks about God taking our sin and dumping it into the sea. I love that verse. I want you to get a visual on that verse right now. I want you to imagine that right now as I'm speaking, God is rounding up all of my sin. Every sin that Alan Rigg has ever committed, he's rounding it all up. Make yourselves comfortable. This could take a while. We're waiting. We're waiting. I know it's awkward. It's my sin. This is embarrassing. We're waiting. Okay, he's got it. Now he's dumping it into the Mediterranean Sea. I want you to picture the storm surge. Like beaches all around the Mediterranean are disappearing. Coastal cities are being flooded with water as my sin sinks into the deep, dark depths of the Mediterranean in a field of bubbles. And only finally does it hit the seabed, sending silt in every direction that only slowly settles until finally my sin is covered. And no one can see it, and no one can find it. No one's going to dredge it up, not even God himself, because he promises not to. With that picture in mind, do you think there could ever come a time in your life or in mine when we are allowing guilt from our past to rob us of the future that God has for us, that God might say to us, I'm over it, why aren't you? Have you allowed a handful of guilty memories to define you, to control your life, to tell you who you are? This is one more of those things where we get to say, enough is enough. That going forward, I'm not going to live from that guilty place anymore. I'm going to live from this forgiven place instead. Well, not only was there guilt from her past, I think there was hurt from her past. I think she'd had a falling out with her family. We haven't gotten there yet, but it mentions her family in verse 13. So I know this is conjecture on my part, but if she had family in Jericho, and if they weren't helping her financially, and if, as far as we can tell, they weren't doing anything to get her out of the lifestyle that she was trapped in, is it not at least possible that they'd had a falling out? That she was hurt, that they were hurt, that there was more than enough hurt to go around? There usually is. Have you been hurt? Is there anger? Is there bitterness? Is there resentment in your life? I mean, the truth is we've all been hurt, right? And you know why hurt from our past robs us of the future that God has for us? Because we don't give forgiveness. So guilt robs us because we don't get forgiveness. Hurt robs us because we don't give it. Have you ever heard that saying, hurt people, hurt people? There's a lot of truth to that. Here's what we do. We're all like this. This is our posture. Like, no, I'm not going to forgive you. Oh, you owe me. Like, you owe me big time. You owe it to me to be miserable, like for the rest of your life. I mean, it gets so bad. No, really, it gets so bad, we're laying awake in bed at night. We're not counting sheep. We're thinking thoughts like this. We're telling ourselves stories like this one, like, I hope I never see them again. No, I hope I do, because I've got a thing or two to say to them. Like, what if I ran into them at the grocery store, the hardware store? I'd act like I didn't even know them. That'd be good. Well, no, because I got these zingers I've been working on, so I'd have to acknowledge them. So I would go up to them, and I would say this, and they'd be speechless. That'd be awesome. Well, no, because I got more zingers, so they'd have to respond. So I would say this, and then they would say that, and it'd be really stupid, so then I'd say this. Meanwhile, here they are at home. I mean, they don't even know we're thinking that stuff. Or worse, they know, and they totally do not care. This is why we say that forgiveness is a gift that we give ourselves. When I forgive the person who's hurt me, it effectively ends any control that they have over my life. Now, if you've been hurt recently or deeply, I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, who is this guy and why is he here? It can be really hard to hear somebody talk about your hurts as if they're nothing. Well, first of all, let me just acknowledge, I don't think they're nothing. I think there's something. Maybe it would help if I said that there's a world of difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. Reconciliation takes two. For that reason alone, reconciliation is not always possible. Now, you'll hear that in church. Let me add something that you might hear in church, but not necessarily as often. Not only is reconciliation not always possible, but it isn't always, not in every single situation, desirable. You know, take Miranda's story, where it would not be safe for Miranda or for our daughter, Odessa, to be reconciled to their perpetrator. But while it takes two people to reconcile, it takes one person to forgive. Did you know that? You can, I can decide all by ourselves to let go of this sense that this person owes us. Now, I know, here's the pushback again, like, wait a minute. If I forgive them, what I'm saying is that what, I'm saying to them, like, what you did wasn't wrong. What you did didn't hurt. That's not what you'd be saying. Here's what you'd be saying. You'd be saying what you did was wrong. What you did hurt. But holding this relational IOU over your head is tearing me up, so I'm tearing it up. I refuse to lose even one more day of my life to this sense of angst over this unresolved relational thing. And so I'm letting go. This is one more of those things where we get to say enough is enough. Going forward, I'm not going to live from that hurt place anymore. I'm going to live from this forgiving place instead. So if we're going to live heroically, we have to let go of the past. And now moving more quickly, as you'll see. The second thing we have to do is face our fears. Let's read verses 2 through 7. It was told the king of Jericho, saying, "Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country." So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, "Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country." Then the woman took the 2 men and hid them. So she said, "Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it happened as the gate was being shut when it was dark that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them." But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them by the road to the Jordan to the fords, and as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. So the spies had been followed. They'd been found out. Could Rahab live heroically? Well, not unless she faced her fears. Man, fear is such a universal thing. Have you guys ever seen that website, phobialist.com? It's crazy. If you check it out when you get home, this website has cataloged over 500 phobias. It's like you're scared of stuff you hadn't even thought of yet. Anybody here afraid of, say, heights? Yeah, so you're not even raising your hand all the way up over your head, because that would be like too far off the ground. Anybody here have like an unnatural fear of needles? I mean, nobody really likes to get a shot, but for you, that's awful. What about like an unnatural fear of spiders? Like for you, that's the real home invasion. There's a spider in your house. How many people are just afraid to raise their hand in public? You pass, you pass, you pass. I'll bet you there's some coffee somewhere. You guys are done. You can go get some coffee. The rest of us have some more work to do. You know, I'm thinking about my adult daughter, Lauren. When she was a kid, she was terrified of people in costumes, which is why I thought it was a really bad idea the year that she wanted to celebrate her birthday at Chuck E. Cheese, where the whole point is to have a person in a costume come to the table. So I have this picture that I'm thinking of right now, and it was taken at the moment that the rat was stalking the birthday girl. And so, seriously, like Lauren has jumped up in Daddy's arms. And so, you know, I'm holding on to her, she's holding on to me, and her eyes bigger than the pizzas on the table, man. It's unbelievable. Whether it was her childhood fear of people in costumes or my nearly crippling fear of a coffee shortage, we've all got stuff that freaks us out. But seriously, think of how powerful fear is. I mean, for real, like have you ever been so scared that you did something you wouldn't normally do? I've totally done that. Or have you ever been so scared that you didn't do something that you normally would do? I've totally done that. So how powerful is fear to control us like that, right? Maybe that's why the most oft-repeated command in the Bible is do not be afraid. Did you know that? All the do's and don'ts in the Bible, the one that appears more than any other is do not be afraid. We'll double back to that in just a minute. But the funny thing is, think about what we've been talking about. If guilt and hurt are over here from our past, well, we usually think of fear as being over here about the future. But don't make the mistake of thinking that these things are unrelated. You know what I'm discovering? What I'm discovering is that if I don't make peace with the past, I will almost always fear the future. And Rahab, she had every reason to be afraid. She was about to risk her life hiding the spies and lying for them, which raises an ethical issue, right? I mean, this too could be like a Bible study in itself. I'm just going to really quick give you my take on that. Do you want to know what I think about her lying about that? Like, is it cool? Is it not cool? Let me just give you this take. For me, I would compare what Rahab did to what people in Europe during World War II did, who took Jewish people into their homes and hid them. And then if Nazis came knocking on the door demanding to know whether there were Jewish people present, they lied and said no. They chose life-saving over truth-telling when it wasn't possible to do both. Two absolute moral obligations came into unavoidable conflict, and they chose the greater good, I believe, without guilt. Now, we can disagree about that and be friends. But do consider this. Let's say, God forbid, let's say there was an active shooter situation, right? And let's say that at the last moment, you were able to get backstage. And then the shooter asks me, is there anybody else here? I'm going to say no. I'm going to trust God with my life. I'm going to say no to try to save yours. Now, if the roles are reversed, if I manage to get backstage and they ask you if there's somebody else here, you can be like, yeah, Rigg just dove backstage. If you hurry, you can catch him. So you ought to feel really good about hanging out with me. Me with you, not so much, but just throwing that out there. Just something to think about. Love you guys. Have you ever played it safe only to regret it later? You have, right? Like what about that time that you struck out looking? And all these years later, you're still like, oh, if only I'd have taken a cut at that pitch. What about that time you knew the answer, but you could not get your voice to come out of your throat? Or that time that you wanted to volunteer so bad, but you just couldn't pick up the pen and, put your name on the roster or whatever? What about that time that you couldn't decide about the house or the car and somebody else got it? Or that time, you know the one, you were so close, you were like this close to telling somebody how you really felt about them, but you chickened out. And then maybe you never had another opportunity. Rahab, she could have played it safe. She could have. She could have played it safe by refusing to hide the spies. She could have refused to lie for the spies. Instead, she risked the life that she had, the only life she knew, for the life that she wanted. To live heroically, you always have to risk your life as it is. And that is so scary. That's why we're talking about facing our fears. Now, I know, again, what you're probably thinking. You're talking about taking risks. Do I look like a risk taker to you, Alan? Maybe that's what's going through your mind. Are you one of those people that would say you have a low risk tolerance? Or maybe no risk tolerance at all? See, I'm not buying it, not for 1 minute. Not that long ago, I was in a bookstore. You guys remember those? They had shelves and these things with covers and pages, and they were cool. I liked them a lot. So I took this one book off the shelf and I looked at the title. The title was The 100 Most Dangerous Things in Everyday Life and What to Do About Them. Do not read that book. That book wrecked my mind. I'm still trying to get over it. Did you know that every year in the United States, more people are killed by teddy bears than by grizzly bears? Really? Like a button can come off, you can have a choking incident. Did you know that every year in the United States, 40,000 people are injured by their television set? Yeah, now I have to admit, more than once we've been watching America's Funniest Videos, AFV. We've seen a couple of kids roughhousing and they're rolling across the room and they roll into a piece of furniture that starts to wobble, a TV tumbles off, you can have a crushing injury. Against my better judgment, I'll give you one more example. Did you know that every year in the United States, 60,000 people are injured using the toilet? Right? So don't tell me that you're not a risk taker. Unless you're prepared to hold it. Forever. The question is not whether to risk, but what. So listen, let's bring it in for a second here. Will you risk the life that you have for the life that you want, the life that God wants for you? Or are you going to risk the life that you want, the life that God wants for you, to hold on to the life that you have? The idea is to face your fears. What are you afraid of? What would you do tomorrow if you weren't scared? In the verses we're about to read, we'll be reading the rest really quick, because I know it's getting late. But in verse 9, she uses a couple of fear words. In verse 11, she uses a couple of fear phrases. Then when you get to the New Testament and you read about Rahab, it says nothing about her fear and everything about her faith. What does that tell us? Well, see, we think heroes feel no fear, but Rahab was scared out of her mind. So it must be that heroes feel fear, they just refuse to be controlled by it. So let's go back then to the most common command in the Bible. It says, do not be afraid, which means that there is a way of being where though we feel fear, like literally everybody else with a pulse, we refuse to let it control us. Imagine that. Imagine for you a life that's not, formed in fear, thoughts that aren't fueled by fear, future plans not forged in fear. If we're going to live heroically, we let go of the past, we face our fears, and finally we believe. Let's read quickly, verse 8. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, mother, brothers, sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. Now quickly, I want you to notice what she said in verse 11. She spoke of one God, singular. She spoke of a personal God. She used the personal pronoun, your God. She spoke of an all-powerful, everywhere present at once God when she described him as, quote, in heaven above and on earth beneath, end quote. This is the language of faith. I believe that Rahab had come to believe, as evidenced, too, by the actions that she takes. Now, picking it up in verse 14. So the men answered her, our lives for yours, if none of you tell this business of ours. And it shall be when the Lord has given us the land that we will deal kindly and truly with you. And then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, get to the mountain lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Afterwards you may go your way. So the men said to her, we will be blameless of this oath of yours, which you have made us swear, unless when we come into the land, you bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And unless you bring your father, mother, brothers, and all your father's household to your own home. So it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be in his own head, and we will be guiltless. And whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. And if you tell this business of ours, then we will be free from your oath which you made us swear. And then she said, according to your word, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed, and she bound the scarlet cord in the window. Now, notice in verse 15, it says not once but twice that she lived on the city wall. So remember we talked about the double walls, right? So I'm over here, you and I, we're hanging out today, and we are on the approach to Jericho. And from our vantage point, we can see both walls. We can see the inner wall, and we can see the outer wall. We don't really care right now, for our purposes, about the inner wall. We're focused on the outer wall where Rahab lived. Go home, check 3 sources. You'll get 3 different descriptions of this outer wall. One possibility is this, that what we would see would be like a 15-foot earthen retaining wall, and on top of that, like a 25-foot brick wall. So you see Rahab's window? Let's approach together. We're going to walk right up to that wall, right up underneath her window, and we're going to look up. Means we're looking up roughly 40 feet, right? Which raises a question. What in the world was Rahab doing with a 40 or 50-foot rope laying around the house? I mean, did everybody in Jericho keep a 50-footer in the coffee table? Did everybody who lived on the wall keep a 50-foot rope on a hook by the open window? I don't know, but I'm guessing that these were not the first men to make a hasty escape from Rahab's place. Just throwing that observation out there. So she helps these guys, get out the wall that way. Why didn't she go with them? She could have led them to a cave in the hill country of Judah. Then when it was safe, she could have followed them to Acacia Grove. What if they didn't come back? Or what if they came back and didn't keep the deal? Or what if before they could come back and keep the deal, she was found out? They would have killed her for sure if they knew what she was up to, right? Only one reason, and that's her family. But hold on. That family. The family that, as far as we know, wanted nothing to do with her or she with them. That family that had forgotten about her, that had forsaken her, that family. Could Rahab live heroically? Well, not unless she believed. Not unless she believed in God, which I believe she had come to. Not unless she believed in herself, by which I mean to believe in the woman that God was making her. And not unless she believed in the future, by which I mean the future that God was forming for her, but not for her alone. For her and for others. The crazy thing is that she had so many reasons not to care about anybody's future but hers, right? She'd been overlooked by the eligible bachelors of Jericho. She'd been used by immoral men from far and wide. She'd apparently been abandoned by her own family. Who would blame her for wanting to get out and never look back? But the idea is to believe God for a big future that makes us and others bigger. You know, as Christians, we love talking about the future, don't we? We talk about vision. We've got vision for our church and vision for our ministry and vision for our life. And, you know, we talk about having like a God-given dream. So hear me now. If your God-given dream is only big enough for you, that's not God's dream for you. God's dream for you will always be so big that there's room in it for you and there's room in it for others. And Rahab is the most amazing case in point. When you get to chapter 6, you find out that, you know, when the battle for Jericho goes down, Rahab and her family are spared. And then just 2 verses later, we find out that when the book of Joshua was written, that Rahab was alive and well and living as a part of their community. How awesome is that? It's awesome, but it's nothing compared to this. Because you know what? You get to the end of the Old Testament, and then you turn those blank pages between the Testaments. And then you turn to that first book of the New Testament, and you turn to the first chapter of the first book. And you turn to the first verses of the first chapter, and there you find a tree. Not just any tree, a family tree. And not even just any family tree, it's Jesus' family tree. And I got to tell you about this tree, like it is really impressive. It has these massive branches that go off in every direction. And if you look close, on each branch is carved a name. On each branch, the name of a woman or a man who lived heroically. And on one branch, for all the world to see, for me to see, for you to see tonight, R-A-H-A-B, Rahab. You know what that means, right? That means that not only was she living in their community, it means that she'd met someone. It means that she'd fallen in love and gotten married. It means that she had kids who had kids who had kids until finally one of her kids was Jesus, God in the flesh, the Savior of the world. And then he rightly see in the color of the cord she was instructed to tie in her window, that scarlet cord suggesting the blood that Jesus would one day shed on the cross to make all of this amazing stuff possible for you and for me. Oh my goodness. I mean, clearly Rahab had a unique ability to believe God for a bigger future, but do you think that even Rahab could have foreseen this? From prostitute to mother. How long? How long had Rahab worn that label? Prostitute. And God just comes along and takes hold of the corner. And listen, rip! And in its place, he puts a new label that says mother. You know, you heard Miranda's story tonight. My story is similar to hers. Around the same time frame, 8-9 years ago, I was pastoring Calvary Austin. And long story short, my wife left me and our then 17-year-old daughter. It was just me and Lauren for Lauren's senior year. And, marriage ended in divorce. I ended up resigning. I lost everything, just like Miranda. I lost my marriage. I lost my ministry. I lost all of my material things. I mean, I remember the day I came home and there was a foreclosure notice on the door of my house. I remember the day that I had to return my car. Lost everything. We both know what it's like to live labeled lives. We both know what it's like to wear a label that says divorced and to have some people in our world who won't ever let us forget. But God comes along and he takes hold of the corner of Miranda's label. And listen, rip. And in its place, he puts a new label. Instead of divorced, the new label says wife, my wife. And he takes hold of the corner of my divorce label. And listen, rip. And in its place, he puts a new label that says husband. What label do you need to hear God just tearing away from you tonight? Failure, rip. Loser, rip. Sinner, rip. What label do you need to see God putting in its place?